I'm going to begin this episode by highlighting the absurdity of our modern political condition, where the ruling class, captured by racialized capitalism, wants power over everything but accountability for absolutely nothing. From the Texas floods to the re-escalating war in Ukraine to the Epstein files cover up, the best they have to give you, in the words of my own Texas Governor Greg Abbott, top official in charge of the world's eighth largest economy, is that winners don't point fingers.
You ask, and I'm going to use your words. Who's to blame? Know this. That's the word choice of losers.
Hell yeah.
Let me explain one thing about Texas. And that is, Texas, every square inch of our state cares about football. You could be in Hunt, Texas, Huntsville, Texas, Houston, Texas, any size community, they care about football. High school, Friday night lights, college football, or pro. And know this, every football team makes mistakes. The losing teams are the ones that try to point out who's to blame. The championship teams are the ones that say, don't worry about it, man, we got this. We're going to make sure that we go score again, that we're going to win this game. The way winners talk is not to point fingers. They talk about solutions. What Texas is all about is solutions.
I don't know. I think what we could call the political class is really losing track of messaging right now. The Texas floods in conjunction with the them being the Epstein files don't exist. Really not a great week for Republican or conservative PR in the American empire.
Oh yeah, it's been. I mean, at this particular stage, I think the Republicans have lost a lot of even the support that they had, especially under Trump. A lot of the MAGA supporters are grandiosely disappointed in what's going on. And it's a complete 180-degree turn.
Yeah, didn't expect to see it, but here we are. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that doesn't paywall its primary content, unlike friggin' Reuters, who this week decided to introduce a $1 a week paywall for the first time ever, and get ready for that to go up during the next fiscal year. Yeah, Reuters, are you kidding me? Was trying to read a bad take about Syria this morning, but no, I had to enter my credit card information. You know why we shouldn't paywall the quote free press? It's an ideal that never really existed, but the main fallout of paywalls is the weakening of public discourse. By limiting access to well-researched and contextualized news, paywalls can contribute to a less informed public and a decline in the productive public discourse. The counter argument being, who really pays attention to mainstream media anymore, for good reason. The past 2 years have really demonstrated why you shouldn't do that. But the real thing is the potential for reduced local coverage. A study found that newspapers that implemented paywalls on average reduced their local news coverage, especially in smaller markets. Like, I don't know, the people covering the Texas floods or the disastrous New Mexico floods that happened 2 days later that nobody's talking about. Well, whatever. We here at Colonial Outcasts are on Patreon, where you can still get exclusive content, mostly with a comedic bent, but still join as free members and get access to all of our episodes. I'm not about to get into a rant. So I'm your host, Greg Stoker, and we are gathered here today with our regular geopolitical contributor, Elina Xenophontos, to talk about the Gaza ceasefire farce, the impending resumption of the war in Lebanon, potentially, the push to secure the entire Levant for Western interests in order to encircle Iran before attacking it again, and then tying all of this into the recent BRICS summit in Brazil, which concluded on Monday. So, of course, BRICS is full of its own contradictions and definitely played it safe with its messaging this year, but it's getting increasingly hard to ignore as the voice of the global South. Also, there's been some speculation. President Xi Jinping declined to attend the talks in Rio this week. It was his first no-show at the BRICS summit and not well explained. But we're going to get into all of that and the implications of having India be the chair of BRICS in 2026. It's a truly complicated beast of a multilateral organization, obviously. So I know Alina's prepared a bunch of stuff on that. But before we dive in, a quick announcement while everyone's still filtering in. For the Americans and anyone else who relies on fruit and vegetable and wine exports from California, a farm worker labor strike is coming. They will be passing their work during the largest pausing. I don't know why I wrote passing. Pausing their work during the largest harvest season of the year and are demanding a real path to citizenship, an end to deportations, dignity, and protection for all undocumented essential workers. So California farm workers, just so you know, within the context of like North America, specifically America, 80% of all fruits come from California, 60% of all vegetables come from California, 90% of all nuts come from California. That should piss off the Resnicks, the Zionist billionaires who fund the Iran hawk think tank Washington Institute for Near East Policy, because their single biggest competitor in the pistachio market is Iran. Gotta love capitalism. And like, let's not even mention the wines. So the exact strike dates will be announced via social media and news channels. Press conferences will take place in LA and Bakersfield. There will be ways for each and every one of you to support the strike, and we'll talk about that more later when it gets closer to happening. If you work in the service industry, you may be affected by this, so plan accordingly and don't blow too much money this month on Coke. Anyways, PSA over. One more thing before we get into the bulk of the episode. You may have noticed over the past few days that Grok, Elon Musk's AI program, has started referring to itself as Mecha Hitler and preaching white supremacist replacement theory. Just wanted to say that Grok going full Nazi because its owner didn't like it answering honestly is the future of AI. Have fun, kids. Elina, this timeline is like really stupid, but like, what are your thoughts on AI as a research tool? Just real briefly.
Oh, well, I mean, there's been a lot of actual papers published on this, because at the end of the day, as I think it's been pretty much reaffirmed, it's controlled information for the most part. And it's the way that the algorithms work within AI is generally to produce particular information that tailors towards a specific narrative. There's nothing intelligent, as I said, about it. It's artificial information, and people shouldn't overly rely on it. I think you can extract certain information if you're looking for something quick, but it shouldn't in any way replicate, sort of your source of information. That's the one thing. And then also from the perspective of, what it will do in terms of replacing the workforce and its ability to kind of infiltrate the way it's going to kind of change our understanding of the economy and the way markets work. It's obviously going to be another form of class warfare. That's, I guess, a quick way to synopsize what my opinion is of AI.
Yeah, the agricultural secretary for the U.S. said 2 days ago that what they want to do is basically automate the agricultural force. It's coming into every
For the most
sector.
part.
Yeah,
And also surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
Also surveillance as well. We also see, I think it was today, a new sort of, I think Trump had signed in another sort of I haven't looked into it as I probably should have, because I've been working on other topics today, but there was a new sort of declaration that was passed in that was going to essentially, I guess, share AI data now with Israel, etc. So the way in that it's going to operate in terms of warfare, surveillance, oppression, especially under this new sort of more overt fascism of the stage of capitalism that we're in, it's obviously going to work again against the working class and against any sort of liberation and revolutionary movements that may or may not take place as we're at this particular stage of imperialism. So I think that's another way to consider, the threats of AI, I'd say.
Right. And there's a reason a lot of these AI companies and defense contractors also have like subsidiaries that do like really harmless photo generation, and they make the cute videos. It's a psyop, y'all. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it also destroys the environment. So I would encourage doing it the old fashioned way. This is what we do around here. Of course, like in terms of like preliminary research tools, it's not the worst, but like that's just the beginning of where you should start, and definitely far from where you should end up. But anyways, let's do the episode. We've got Gaza, Lebanon, the wider Levant, and then BRICS. So here we go. Basically, just to contextualize, there's been so much to keep up this news cycle. We keep saying that every week, so we should just shut up and just get into it. Basically, this is how the Gaza ceasefire stands. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday, being July 9th, that his talks with the U.S. that was this morning. With the U.S. President Donald Trump focused on securing the release of captives from Gaza while vowing to continue the genocidal war against the besieged enclave until all of Tel Aviv's goals are achieved. He posted on X in Hebrew because these guys are only honest when talking to their own citizens. So this was from, what was this from? This was from, yesterday. I held another meeting today with President Trump. And if you're listening to the audio, this is Netanyahu's official Twitter post, because apparently we now conduct the affairs of state on social media. I held another meeting today with President Trump at the White House, followed by a brief meeting with Vance. We focus on the efforts to free our hostages. We are not relenting on this for a moment, and this is made possible due to the military pressure exerted by our heroic soldiers. Regrettably, this effort comes at a painful cost with the loss of our finest sons. Of course, they endured a number of zero-distance ambushes over the weekend and lost a bunch of soldiers in Gaza. But we are determined to achieve all our goals: the release of all our hostages, both the living and the fallen, the elimination of Hamas's military and governmental capabilities, and thereby ensuring that Gaza will no longer pose a threat to Israel. Opportunities are opening here to expand the circle of peace, to broaden the Abraham Accords. We are working with this with full vigor. I also expressed to President Trump your appreciation, citizens of Israel, for the support for us, the resolute action he took, and for the joint effort we are undertaking today to bring a great future to the Middle East and a great future to the state of Israel. And, of course, right now, as of today, he's expected to meet with U.S. Senate leaders. And on Tuesday, yesterday, he met with the House Representative Speaker Mike Johnson, after which he told reporters that while he did not believe the war in Gaza was over, negotiators were certainly working on a ceasefire. He said, quote, "We still have to finish the job in Gaza, release all our hostages, eliminate and destroy Hamas's military and governmental capabilities." So, of course, there wasn't a lot of media coverage. They've had a bunch of other confused messaging. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff decided to push back his flight to Doha, where he had been slated to join the ongoing proximity talks between Israel and Hamas. That's being pushed back to later in the week. And finally, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, recently laid out plans to force all of Gaza's population into a, quote, humanitarian city built over the ruins of southern Gaza's Rafah, which has been destroyed by Israeli forces. He said Palestinians would be forced to go through, quote, security screening before entering and would not be allowed to leave once inside. Israeli forces would control the perimeter of the site and initially move 600,000 Palestinians into one area, mostly people currently displaced in the coastal Al-Mawasi area in the south. So again, this is just completely unacceptable terms, because during this 60-day ceasefire, they've expressed that they're going to keep building this concentration camp.
Mm-hmm. They're going to continue building this concentration camp, and they haven't provided a single guarantee that after these 60 days ceasefire that there's going to be basically an end to the war. I mean, it basically gives Israel the right to take back even more of its hostages and then simultaneously be able to continue the war within a 2-month period, which this is exactly what Israel wants to begin with. But I think what's most interesting about the current ceasefire is pretty much the particular point in time that it's coming at. And I think this is kind of where I wanted to focus at. The particular point that it's coming at is at the same time where we're also seeing the U.S. Special Envoy to Lebanon that's essentially calling for the disarmament of Hezbollah, which, by the way, and I think it's very important to clarify, it wasn't part of the Hezbollah-Israeli ceasefire agreement that was established back in November 2024. It was the understanding was that, Hezbollah was going to move further, behind the Litani River and essentially hand over some of its infrastructure and control over certain territories within the south of Lebanon to the Lebanese armed forces, but not that it was going to completely disarm. This is a violation of the understanding of the agreement that was established. And even, I think it was 2-3 days ago, Al Jazeera even published a report with insider information on, the particular agreement that was, between Hezbollah and Israel. And according to those sources, they basically said that the language provided in that agreement was purposefully ambiguous and therefore failed to actually exclusively demand Hezbollah's disarmament. However, the Israeli and the Israeli sort of side and the United States are using that ambiguous kind of language in order to now demand for the disarmament of Hezbollah. Now, in addition to that, I just want to add that this is not only a violation, therefore, of the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, but it's actually also a violation of international humanitarian law. It's a violation of UN Resolution 1701, because at the end of the day, Israel is an occupying power in the south of Lebanon. It has been and now continues to be an occupying power that has actually expanded into 4 other key locations, no matter how big or small. And they're continuing as an occupying power to exercise brutal force against the south of Lebanon, killing, I think, since the ceasefire to today, 250 civilians in the process. And under international law, when there is an occupying force inside a country, there is a right to armed resistance. And given Hezbollah's history that originated as a result of, the occupation of Israel, and it was its entire purpose was to resist the Israeli occupation, it has a right to refuse disarmament until the complete removal of the Israeli occupation forces inside of Lebanon. However, the United States is now calling on the Lebanese state, which is a Western-backed state for that matter. It's a Western-supported state, with the former President Aoun, who is now actually currently in Cyprus. Was a commander of the Lebanese Armed Forces, which is very heavily backed by the West, both the European Union and the United States. They had actually requested that Hezbollah disarm in the next 4 months. Now, Hezbollah has come out and effectively said that this will not, this is not acceptable. From the moment that Israel is continuing to occupy its territory and attack its civilians and attack the south of Lebanon, this is simply unacceptable. So the reason why this is actually significant, given the particular time frame this is happening, is because at the end of the day, Hezbollah is pretty much the vanguard of the acts of resistance in the region. And although it has been significantly weakened as a result, obviously, of the previous Hezbollah war, the pager attacks, the basic assassination of the vast majority of the leadership of Hezbollah, it still remains a resistance force and a powerful force, not just within the Levant, but also within Lebanon, politically, militarily. And from the moment that continues to exist, it will always provide sort of a support, let's just say, and a unified front with the rest of the axis of resistance in the region, as well as, of course, for Palestine. And this becomes a problem because the way it currently stands is that the United States needs to secure the entirety of the region, the entirety of the Levant. It needs to eliminate the axis of resistance in order to be able to normalize with Israel, therefore establishing sort of the normalization process with the Abrahamic Accords, as we currently see, for example, with the new Syrian regime and Syria normalizing with Israel. They want to accomplish the same thing with Lebanon, and they also want to be able to eventually kind of deal with the whole Palestinian issue. And in order to do that, they need to isolate the Palestinian resistance and then sort of establish the Gaza 2035 plan, which we'll get into far later. So my opinion is that the Gaza ceasefire that is currently taking place is more so a strategic maneuver in order to be able to focus on Hezbollah and to focus on Lebanon, because Israel does not have the military capacity to be able to open another front and possibly a far more aggressive front with Lebanon, whilst it has ongoing ground invasion of Gaza where it's taking significant hits, as you rightfully outlined earlier on. It's also occupying vast territories now inside of Syria, and they already do have armed forces in the north. So in order to be able to manage that, which we also have to consider the fact that the IDF is also having a recruitment crisis with many of its reservists refusing to actually serve, but even many of its conscription soldiers actually refusing to serve. They need to try to reserve as much of their military capacity in order to be able to invest in the north. So I'm of the humble opinion that they're just going to temporarily pause the ceasefire inside Gaza in order to be able to essentially handle Hezbollah, which like I said, is going to have a sort of domino effect that will affect the Palestinian resistance, the entirety of the Levant, and then the final stop will eventually be Iran.
No, I definitely think that's true. They're at least trying to isolate them as much as possible. I mean, that's the through line of U.S. foreign policy. If you can't defeat something militarily just through sheer force, and you don't want to necessarily cause a bunch of chaos, you just squeeze. Like we're talking about U.S. regime change operations. Essentially, this is kind of a different situation where they're just trying to collapse a political entity. But aside from U.S. belligerence, they did exercise a lot of patience with their regime change in Syria, for instance. That was over a decade. They've been trying to do it in Iran for a long time, but definitely proven that there could be some sort of like, at least not necessarily strategic patience, but patience out of necessity because there's no other options. So on the diplomatic front, we saw that Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun received American diplomat Thomas Barak in Beirut on Monday and gave him the Lebanese state's reply to a proposal from the U.S. about disarming Hezbollah. Barak, he's also the ambassador to Turkey, and he's a special envoy for Syria, said Lebanon's response was, quote, something spectacular, and that he was unbelievably satisfied by the reply, which has not been made public as of yet. And, he went to receive the Lebanese state officials' response to a U.S. proposal. It was delivered on June 19th to disarm Hezbollah. But here's the thing. Look, he insinuated in his statement after the meeting that support for Lebanon would be contingent on the Lebanese government acting in line with what he said was a region moving at Mach speed. Although, of course, he didn't specify what it was moving towards. But since we're not idiots, he means the expansion of the Abraham Accords and the normalization, the pan-Arab normalization of governments with Israel. But like further pressure is on the country, right? Because it's badly in need of foreign investment. Its economy is in shambles, and it needs aid for reconstruction, which is Israel's fault, which the U.S. has signaled may be tied to disarming Hezbollah. So there's a carrot and there's the stick, and Hezbollah does seem to agree with the Lebanese government and has expressed some willingness to cooperate, not on the disarmament part, but at least in terms of like some political concessions, as it knows many of its supporters need their homes and villages liberated, so on. But, quote, we cannot be asked to soften our stance or lay down arms while Israeli aggression continues, unquote, Hezbollah chief Naim Qassem told supporters in Beirut's southern suburbs this past Sunday for Ashura, which is an important Shia commemoration. So here we are, in terms of like, what have we seen with the Trump administration? He's an official in the Trump administration. They come out, make these grandiose claims about this was a spectacular diplomatic coup for the United States and for Israel, and they're going to disarm Hezbollah. I mean, at this point, do we believe anything that comes out of a diplomat's mouth, in terms of the U.S. government? I would say absolutely not. What is interesting to me, though, in terms of opening another front up immediately, would be this. Let me just open up this article. This is from Haaretz from today. And if we can't trust diplomats, we can trust people's pocketbooks sometimes. So, this was from 2 days ago. This was from Monday. Haaretz, NVIDIA is considering a massive new campus near Israel's now de-escalated border with Lebanon. NVIDIA wanted its second campus in Israel, not far from its other location, which seemed to have tipped the balance against building it near the northern border. But NVIDIA's confirmed on Monday it would consider any proposal made by the Israeli government. So, of course, NVIDIA's stocks are skyrocketing right now. I think they're the first company to ever have been valued at 4 trillion, or was it 4 trillion market cap. Anyways, so as you guys can recall from last year, Intel put the kibosh on building a new chip factory in Israel because it wasn't secure because of the Hezbollah rocket attacks and stuff. So either like NVIDIA has like some insider information about like what Israel intends to do, because of course there are connections to the Israeli defense and tech sector, and so like they've had assurances that that's not going to pop off again, or maybe they believe that Hezbollah is completely disarmed. But this doesn't seem like a good idea or a good sound investment move to be floating on the eve of what could potentially be a re-escalation of hostilities along the border.
So what I was going to say to this, I think this is preparation for what their future plans is of the new Middle East. And I think this is kind of what it is that they're envisioning here. So what do I mean by this? So we can also take a look at the kind of agreements that happened. When was it? I think in May, when Trump had made his visit to essentially the Gulf states and established all these billion-dollar deals and investment plans with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia. Now, I want to focus
new AI hub to beat China.
Exactly. The objective there was to make Saudi Arabia the sort of the new AI hub, like you said, and Bloomberg even said that Saudi Arabia is going to try to somehow replace China, which is absolute delusional sort of rhetoric to even try to claim. But this is what they're going to try to do. And the reason that I bring this up is because it actually connects to, I guess, the whole project Gaza 2035 and how this kind of falls into place in terms of like the I guess the new moves that Witkoff is talking about when he talks about the realignment or the complete change that's happening in West Asia. So if we look at the Gaza 2035 plan, for instance, and this is kind of connect to what we're also currently seeing now take place during the Gaza ceasefire deal, as I think Israel Katz had actually said, is the idea is right now to establish a humanitarian city on the ruins of Rafah, which therefore aligns with the phase one of the Gaza 2035 plan, which was to essentially establish humanitarian bubbles or humanitarian safe zones within the Gaza Strip that would essentially push in and entrap essentially the 2 million Palestinians into these safe zones. And he also then goes on to say, like you said, that there's going to be an advanced form of security screening within this location that's going to be carried out by the Israeli military, or the Israeli occupation forces rather, in order to obviously filter out the resistance from within these territories. Now, this is obviously part and parcel of the plan of placating and pacifying Gaza. Not that that's possible, but this is kind of the agenda. And this is part of the Gaza 2035 plan, that, phase one of the Gaza 2035 plan. So that is essentially controlling the population and trying to asphyxiate the access, the resistance within Gaza in order to be able to better control it. Now, within stage two, what do we like? It's actually even within phase one still. The idea is then to bring in the Arab sort of an Arab coalition, an Arab kind of control over this humanitarian sort of regions. And then gradually this by stage two would establish a sort of joint Arab coalition or rule over the Gaza Strip. And this is going to play very well into some of the objectives that the Gulf states have within the region. And part of that is to allow, for example, Saudi Arabia to be able to have access directly to Gaza's Mediterranean ports. And the idea of establishing pipelines, trade routes, high-speed trains between Saudi Arabia and these Gaza ports, but also simultaneously to connect their e-city with the Eastern Mediterranean, and to have, these, again, like I said, these sort of direct routes into the Eastern Mediterranean. So what we're seeing, and it kind of aligns with what Bloomberg were saying about replacing sort of China, but also creating Saudi Arabia as an AI and tech hub. Saudi Arabia is going to essentially become sort of like the hub for like an alternative to what China was trying to establish within West Asia, the digital Silk Road. And if you take a look at even this, or the Jerusalem Post sort of evaluation of the Gaza 2035 plan, is that it would also turn Gaza itself into a tech hub where essentially they're going to deny the Palestinians completely of statehood. They're going to completely administered by the Gulf states, and then they're going to be used as cheap labor in order to establish these new sort of industries and the complete privatization of the Strip. This is the agenda. I don't think it's going to work, but this is what they're trying to do.
And I wanna back you up on that, not because the Gaza 2035 plan isn't the only plan that's being discussed in these circles. There are other plans. We had this crazy story break about friggin' Tony Blair's think tank working on a very similar plan called the Gaza or Trump Riviera Gaza plan. And if we look, hang on, I'm trying to pull up the slide right now so just you guys can see the article. I'm going with the Guardian's reporting on this. Tony Blair think tank, Trump Riviera Gaza plan. Half their statements are about Tony Blair, who was one of the architects of the Iraq War, who disappeared for years, and now he's back coming up with a redevelopment plan for Gaza. The plan outlined in the slides was reported to have been created to attract Trump's attention and that of wealthy Gulf rulers. Among 10 mega projects, the document includes the MBS ring, obviously Mohammed bin Salman, and NBZ Central highways, named after the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and an Elon Musk smart manufacturing zone. So of course all these different plans, and there's
They all
basically
correlate, though.
they all
They're all
correlate.
rather similar.
Yeah, they're
Hmm.
all rather similar, and they involve tech, privatization, and the involvement of Gulf Arab states.
Exactly. And this is in fact as well why I think the not the foreign minister, but a senior official from Saudi Arabia also visited Lebanon just, I think, as well 6 days ago, just right before the U.S. had actually, the U.S. special envoy had visited, sorry, Lebanon, rather, Lebanon. They had visited Lebanon. And the reason they had actually visited, it was to have these high profile sort of discussions with President Aoun, the prime minister, and also the parliamentary speaker behind closed doors. And it was understood, this is what was reported, is what's coming out of Lebanese media, was to essentially also push forward for the disarmament of Hezbollah. So we can see again how much the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, is also working towards, I guess, the complete dismantlement of the axis of resistance. Because, and going back to what you said about NVIDIA, NVIDIA is one of the highest, like NVIDIA itself was directly involved in the new deals that were made with Saudi Arabia, between the US and Saudi Arabia. So the fact that they're also opening, or they're now considering to open a new, I guess, base inside of Israel at this particular point in time, or I mean, by the time that's actually established at some particular point in time within the medium to long-term future, goes to show, I guess, the general agenda that they have for the region. And that is to secure the Levant and West Asia as a whole firmly within the grips of the West, to try to essentially dismantle and weaken Hezbollah. And by doing so, it will isolate the Palestinian resistance. And like I've said many times before on this program, the Palestinian resistance has been able to accomplish what it has, not only because, of course, the steadfast nature of the Palestinian people and their bravery in terms of fighting the Israeli occupation forces, but also because it was part and parcel of the resistance axis. And Hezbollah's, for example, support on the northern front allowed, the Palestinian resistance inside of Gaza to be able to better manage the occupation forces. So, and we've already seen what the loss of Syria has caused into the acts of resistance, which in fact the new leader of Hezbollah, Naim Kazam, had also, just on his speech on Sunday, had actually reiterated that the loss of Syria was a massive blow to the axis of resistance, particularly when it comes to its intelligence and military capacity. So if, for example, now Hezbollah is going to take a hit, or is in some way weakened to the point that it's dismantled, which is not, I do not believe is possible, which again we can discuss a little afterwards, this would effectively also isolate the Palestinian resistance. And something I also want to bring up here, we have seen time and time again that whenever there is a ceasefire or talks or a ceasefire, it's not meant to be a long-term ceasefire. It is a tactical pause, which then allows Israel or the United States and the West to be able to tackle another front that eventually will then weaken the overall axis, and also by extension Iran. So
I think, yeah, I mean, this is a good demonstration about, how it moves. It's like, what was that children's game? Pop Goes the Weasel. It's like one thing would pop up, you smash it down, and another thing pops up. So even over the last month, with beginning with Operation Midnight Hammer, or Operation Hammered at Midnight, if you're Sec Dev Pete Hegseth. Yeah, that was the focus. And then ceasefire happens because Israel was getting hammered. Boom, shift over to Gaza. We need a ceasefire in Gaza now. And then boom, now there's a shift over to Lebanon. And also there's stuff going on in Syria. And also, if you look behind the scenes, there's a House resolution on the floor called the Bunker Buster Bill, to give, and this is obviously telegraphing intentions, to give Israel access to Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, which cannot be picked up by radar, not even our own radar. And they can have the 30,000 pound massive ordnance penetrators that didn't collapse the facilities, but their capabilities that no one else on the planet aside from the United States have. And that's kind of crazy that we're even thinking about that. But of course, they are our attack dog in the region that destabilizes it for exploitation, so that we can carve it up into comprador vassal states that will do our bidding. So if they can use this to destabilize the region, deter Iran, because their Iron Dome, their massive integrated air defense system did not work, so they need something else to do it. And they're thinking that this could be it. It's just all telegraphing that now that the 12-day war is over, they're taking a tactical pause, moving on to a couple areas that they could actually affect, because Iran wasn't isolated enough for this time.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just going to keep building up their stockpiles, their stores, and get ready for round 2. And in the meantime, it's Lebanon. The Gaza ceasefire is a red herring. They're not going to go for that. The entire reason that these ceasefire talks exist is for the same reason that the talks of a 2-state solution exist. Not because it's ever going to work, or not because the framework is actually workable, but it strings the international community along and gives them political cover to do what they're already doing in the first place. Now, in terms of Syria, too, I think that's going to be the first one to actually formally normalize. Syrian diplomats just returned from Lebanon to start under a UN-backed plan, marking a major shift to relocate thousands of Syrian refugees, who are set to return from Lebanon this week under the first UN-backed plan, providing financial incentives after Syria's new rulers said all citizens were welcome home despite deep war damage and massive security concerns. Massive security concerns, of course, would be a massive understatement for certain minority populations within Syria itself. But we're seeing the push to normalize, and of course, Al-Shara or Jelani, whatever you want to call him, has made his rehabilitation the main thing, and access to political power stemming from the West his main goal. So he's saying he wants as a normalization concession for Israel to retreat back towards their previous illegal occupation line of the Golan Heights, but he'll surrender that just to get the normalization going. And once they have Syria completely normalized, Lebanon they want to be next, and then they're hoping through that Hezbollah will be not just isolated physically, but also completely diplomatically in the region. Then after that, bunker busters to Israel, Iran's next up. And all the while, they're going to keep trying to assassinate prominent figures within the Iranian government. And so, yeah, it's all very transparent what's going on here. But the play is regional. Gaza ceasefire, red herring. And by the way, it's not even a ceasefire. And I did want to make this point about I got asked a question on an interview, why does Hamas keep engaging in ceasefire? Why does Iran keep engaging in ceasefires? One of the main reasons is yes, they know that the United States and Israel are bad faith actors. The worst faith actors actually that exist on the planet, especially because we used diplomacy as a stalling tactic. We use it to disrupt, to play for time, and then to exploit the chaos. It's a tool of that we use for assassinations. But the reason they're doing it, and one of the reasons at least, is because they are demonstrating to the rest of the world that despite decades of demonization of Arabs and Persians, and especially Muslim ones, that they are actually being the rational actors, and that they could be accepted into the global forum and stage. And so no matter how many times Israel breaks a ceasefire, they broke the last ceasefire that Trump instituted over 250 times before they broke it formally. But Hamas will keep coming to the table because it's a demonstration. It's an information operation that they're waging. So we're going to keep seeing that. But in the meantime, don't put any faith in what's going on the superficially and on the surface. We know what they want long term, what they can't say. But if you look at the legislation being passed, you look at what the envoys are saying, we're not children anymore.
No, I completely agree. I mean, in fact, what I would say is that I think at the end of the day, a lot of the resistance factions, they end up and even Iran, they end up falling to some extent prey of this particular tactic that the West tends to employ, because the need to try to prove yourself as being a diplomatic and the good party is exactly what they're banking on.
Yeah, they're doing it on our terms. That's the only issue with that.
That's the only issue that I have with that. And there comes a particular point where you also need to realize that if you continue abiding by their terms and how they're going to shape the narrative, then you're allowing them to essentially be able to control the means by, the timelines and how operations are going to be executed. So, for example, I would therefore argue that, last summer, up until I think the attacks on Hezbollah, the acts of resistance did have the upper hand. However, they kept trying to play the diplomatic route. They used, obviously, the West knows the ethos of the resistance to not obviously target civilians. And, they were trying to establish a deterrence, and they were trying to sort of control the rules of engagement, even when they could see that Israel was constantly escalating. They believed that they would be able to, by controlling sort of the rules of engagement, they'll be able to kind of control the narrative and show the world who really is the malicious actor in this situation. But then what happened? They were caught off guard. The pager attack happened. Then this led to pretty much the invasion and the brutal aerial bombardment of south of Lebanon that ended up killing as well Hassan Nasrallah. So up to a certain point, although I understand what it is that they're doing, I completely agree with that. They are still, by trying to abide by that, in a way, sort of adhering to the sort of Western timeline, still on their rule or on their terms, which is what I find that is something that they need to sort of come out of, because otherwise it's going to be to their own detriment.
Right. I'm kind of free associating right now, but a great corollary to this is like the ruling class in America is a ruling class in America, right? And a great corollary to this is the election to the Democratic primary for the mayoral race in New York City, Zohran Mamdani. He's not a communist. He's a really milquetoast, basic democratic socialist. And, he is a Muslim, but, his mother was a film director. His wife wears mini skirts. He does makes rap videos and stuff. And it really just goes to show you.
Rap videos.
Yeah.
Did not know about those rap videos.
Oh, yeah. It just goes to show you that if you're like Muslim or like have any sort of like socialist tendencies, there's no like common ground that you can deal with these people with. Like there's no, you cannot mold yourself far enough to actually please these people. So
you have to sometimes meet them at their level, and you need to know when to do it. So I think this is what the resistance, what Iran struggles with as well. And it's going to have to come to a point where they're going to have to act. And even if it would appear that they are the ones that are somewhat the aggressor, if you would even like to use that terminology, then so be it. But I also did want to, go back to what it is that you said earlier with regards to Iran as well. This is why I think it's really important for people to understand that the ceasefire that happened between Israel and Iran, a lot of people were actually echoing the sentiments. And I actually wrote an article about this, which I put on my Patreon, on my Substack. And I kind of cautioned people into believing that this is some sort of major victory for Iran. The way I see it is this: Iran will never, in its current form, be allowed to exist. And I've said this before, as you know, they will not be allowed to continue on the path that it is. It will not be allowed to become this intelligence hub, this AI hub under the BRI and under, BRICS. It will not be allowed to economically prosper because, and I kind of want to tie into here a little bit with the BRICS summit, which just sort of finished, and why it's important. Because when we look at, for example, even the declaration of the BRICS summit 2025, if you look at a lot of the goals and the agenda, we're looking at essentially the establishment of, international settlements, that a BRICS international settlement sort of a mechanism to be put in place. I think Putin had actually kind of said that in his speech, and then that was also then incorporated in, I think it was under Article 47 of the declaration. You're looking at, for example, this international settlement that they're trying to establish via BRICS and via the New Development Bank, which is the bank for BRICS, is looking at obviously establishing, bilateral trades and exchanging, sort of trade and payments in national currencies. Yeah, if you want to say something, and then I'll finish off what it is that I'm saying.
Oh, no, go ahead up and finish. If we're going to transition to BRICS, I think we should like contextualize.
Oh no, but I was kind of bring it back to Iran.
Okay, yeah.
So
Yeah,
in the sense of like how this plays in for Iran specifically, and why this is important. I've kind of just provided a bit of context. So what I was going to say is like when you start looking into these sort of mediums and objectives behind what BRICS is trying to establish, which is essentially a way to remove international trade and international finance away from the Western sphere of influence, how Iran plays into that, but most importantly, how these new systems that the BRICS alliance is trying to establish that will look at, like I said, establishing international payment system in their own national currencies, also providing loans in their own national currencies that will therefore prevent the sort of depreciation of national currencies that occurs when loans are issued, obviously, in the dollar, allowing for this kind of industrialization to take place, but also the kind of mutual economic prosperity, which was pretty much the underpinnings of the BRICS summit. This effectively means that Iran, that is at the center of this, because a lot of the trade routes, pipelines, but also the digital kind of Silk Road would be passing through Iran. This would be an avenue of enormous economic prosperity for Iran, something that has not been available to Iran since pretty much the 1979 revolution. So what does this mean for Iran? It means that it's going to become militarily even more powerful. I mean, if we saw the kind of damage that it was able to inflict on Israel now, after decades worth of economic sanctions and isolation, imagine what Iran will be capable of in 5-10 years from now, if BRICS is able to establish, and they are already establishing, these alternative systems that will bypass sanctions, that will be able to establish these sort of trade relations with the rest of the world and the global south. Iran will become economically more powerful, politically more powerful, and as that happens, it will also therefore provide it with the resources it needs to be able to further support the axis of resistance in the region. And this is something that the West absolutely, and Israel, cannot accept. This is another reason why they are, so this is a race against time right now to try to, I guess, target the acts of resistance, normalize Syria, even when, although Jelani's come out and he's basically said that he's willing to, sort of normalize and sign the Abraham Accords, even though Syria has not been, consolidated. I mean, it's still a country that it's in chaos and civil war with, massacres taking place on a daily. But even within that framework, and, with Hezbollah still existing within Lebanon, they're going to try to defeat Hezbollah because it is, at the end of the day, one of the most powerful, paramilitary organizations in the world, and it is a huge, powerful force, even politically within Lebanon, that can simply not be allowed to exist. So my humble opinion is they've done what they've done with regards to Iran. Iran did take its own particular hits, especially when considering the impact that it had on its nuclear, three of its nuclear sites. But now what they're going to try to do is they're going to move away from Gaza temporarily, try to target Hezbollah, isolate, try to weaken Hezbollah as far as possible, try to therefore gain power over Lebanon, destroy the axis of resistance, and then effectively this is going to isolate and contain Iran. But not only is it going to isolate and contain Iran, it's going to essentially be a strategic attack on BRICS itself, which is one of the greatest threats to Western imperialism. This is why the belief that the ceasefire was a huge victory for Iran, and therefore this is just, the West has just run away. It hasn't. It's also gained strategic military intelligence, and now all it's doing is reorganizing within the region to eventually try to target Iran at a later point. Now, when that later point is a matter of, depending on like the material conditions of that time, and then it's going to target Iran one way or another, and in doing so, the BRICS.
So that's a good transition. So we started with the Gaza ceasefire, expanded to Lebanon, then the Levant, Gulf states, Iran, and now BRICS. Apparently, all Trump can really do about it is, reestablish the tariff threats. But let's talk about it, because BRICS, I think, is kind of a little over, in my opinion, a little over idolized at the moment. It's like full of its own contradictions. And the biggest one, which I'm definitely going to talk about in the last 20 minutes, is the place I used to live, India. It's an incredibly problematic BRICS country. But let's just do a quick context in case you weren't tracking the BRICS summit. Happened in Rio over the weekend, ended Monday. But like much of the international media coverage surrounding the 2025 BRICS summit focused on who wasn't in the room. The Western media was like, who wasn't in the room? Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Their absence, well, obviously, I think, is Brazil part of the Rome Statute for the ICC stuff?
I think so.
All right, so
I think
that's
yes,
why
that's why Putin wasn't able to attend.
yeah, he also didn't attend the one in South Africa for the same reason. But yeah,
Mhm.
the Xi Jinping's absence spurred renewed speculation about the coherence and future of the BRICS format, which began as a grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, later added South Africa, and in the past couple of years has enlisted several new members, and one of which is Iran. Yet beyond the headlines, really, Brazil's tenure at the head of the expanded BRICS yielded several notable outcomes that reflect both BRICS members' difficulty in finding common ground and their ability to make some important progress in areas of shared interest. That last paragraph that I just read was taken out of an Atlantic Council bio, so take that with a grain of salt. But anyways, what did come out of Rio? Well, again, there was a joint declaration titled, quote, Strengthening Global South Cooperation for a More Inclusive and Sustainable Governance, unquote, summarized the outcomes and reaffirmed many of BRICS group's long-standing priorities. Chief among these were calls for the reform of multilateral institutions, including the usual call for Brazil and India to become permanent members of the UN Security Council. There was also an expected call for voting power in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to be readjusted to reflect a changing global order. Good luck with that. On climate, the group introduced a new framework for joint action, an important signal of the group's coordinated position ahead of the upcoming UN climate change conference known as the COP30, which will be held also in Brazil in November. On technology, the statement advocated for more inclusive global discussions on artificial intelligence governance, echoing concerns that global South perspectives are often underrepresented in these debates. Among more contentious points, of course, the declaration also contentious from the Western perspective. The declaration also touched on ongoing conflicts, calling for peace in Gaza and condemning recent bombings in Iran, a member of BRICS, of course, and attacks on Russian civilian infrastructure. I guess like one of the things you were talking about too is like one of the more tangible outcomes was the proposal for an institution inspired by the World Bank's multilateral investment guarantee agency. This new institution would be aimed at facilitating infrastructure and development investment across the global South by providing investment guarantees to reduce political risks. And of course, that would go straight into like, oh, what's happening in Iran as well. So that's kind of like a huge threat that you were talking about. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, we were talking on the phone about this statement. I have my own thoughts. You want to go ahead with yours?
I mean, listen, which I'm sure you're probably going to fall off of. The BRICS alliance, one of its, I guess, limitations is that it's trying to bring in a cluster of different countries that have their own particular agenda in the greater scheme of things. Yes, it's become to a certain degree a kind of a representative force of the global South, fundamentally because of these sorts of declarations and the fact that it's calling for a fairer international legal order, financial order, and general fair sort of economic terms and conditions that would obviously be able to allow the global South states to be able to economically prosper, as opposed to establishing the sort of exploitative relationship that it has. So, for example, I think it was Lavrov. He gave like a pretty interesting speech where he kind of said, and I think this kind of ties in with the actual declaration, where he had effectively said, he called out the IMF for essentially bypassing its own quotas in order to be able to fund like a third of its finances are going, if not more, to Ukraine. And Ukraine is getting far more as a single country. The entirety of the African continent is getting together getting as a single unit in order to be able to invest in their own infrastructure, et cetera. So, the way that the IMF, which, like I said many times before, is an instrument of the United Nations, just like the World Bank is kind of acting, and not only as, in these private institutions to a certain degree that, are enslaving and establishing debt bondage over the vast majority of the global South, but also the way that it chooses to operate. It's a violation of its own rules and constitutions, international law, and it's meant to obviously, it politicizes even the way that it actually tries provide its own funds, which therefore provides the incentive for countries in the global South to look to to institutions like BRICS that are trying to establish all these other alternatives in terms of loans, banking systems, the BRICS payment system, for example, which would allow them to bypass SWIFT and therefore avoid being sanctioned by the West, but also, like you said, international sort of establishing the BRICS settlement settlement payment systems, all of these things in national currencies it does appeal to the global South, that it is looking for an alternative, does want that representation. It does enjoy as well the fact that the BRICS has become this sort of force that speaks on behalf of the global South, like I said, speaking to the inequalities and the injustice of the way the financial system works, but also the fact that, like you said, BRICS has actually called as part of its declaration that there should be more countries of the global South that are represented even in the United Nations Security Council, and generally be provided with greater sort of rights in terms of voting within the United Nations, institutions as a whole, which of course, therefore, speaks to, would speak to countries of the global South that are seeking for that fairness. However, also something that's also worth noting, they did also, provide a pretty good, I would say, declaration with regards to what's happening in Gaza as well, which was pretty decent. I mean, at the very, they called it, they actually for the first time as well referenced the ICJ ruling, called out Gaza for being occupied, and also, the right for resistance. However, and I think this is where you could probably follow off of this. It's still, the fact, for example, when you read the declaration, it still speaks in terms of reforming the Western institutions, not trying to antagonize the West, the desire to just simply try to adjust, or if anything, actually bring about the initial intention behind, for example, what the World Trade Organization was supposed to do. So if anything, what the declaration is arguing and what a lot of these BRICS leaders are stating is that we're not trying to replace or provide an alternative, but actually trying to balance out institutions that otherwise would have worked, but unfortunately have been exploited. So, it comes as they pretty much did. It's more of they present themselves as being somewhat reformist. And the reason that they're doing this is because obviously you have countries like Brazil, you have countries like India, and also the UAE, for example, among other states, and they're trying to balance these states and their agenda and their goals and their collaboration with the West, but also to appeal to them. And the problem is that these countries themselves, they also do serve the interests of the West. And I think you can speak to that. I'll let you speak about India. And so this creates a problem within the BRICS alliance, and its ability to form an ideological separation from that of the rules-based order, and to really counter it head on, because they're trying to appeal to these states that are still functioning off of liberal capitalist democracies, that are still agents and have of the West, that still are corporate door states and still have direct relationships with the West. So I think that creates an obstacle for BRICS. And in its own, like you said, it has its own innate contradictions, and trying to manage that is becoming a problem.
And we don't need to go into all the contradictions. We'd be here for days, but we can take one and use it as a microcosm. And well, it's bigger than a microcosm. It is India. Of course, we all love India and the people, not the Hindutva fascists, but everybody else, and especially not the government. So just to give some context about why India is just inherently, they're not doing anything new. They're doing what they've always done, which was during the Cold War. You had Maoist China, you had the USSR. They always had like strained relationships with Russia generally because of, the great game between the imperial, imperialist, between imperial Tsarist Russia and the British Raj. And there's just like a whole bunch of bad blood alongside Iran too, with regards to Russia. But anyways, during the Cold War, they had this position, what we call strategic autonomy. They didn't really want to get involved in the great game. So basically, they bought a bunch of weapons from Russia, also took some other measures, had a security relationship with the USSR while developing a free market trade economy with the United States. And that's kind of been one example of their geopolitical fence sitting since the early days of their independence and the Cold War. So this is nothing to be expected. They're definitely, from my perspective, playing both sides of the fence here between like BRICS and their historic relationship with Western capitalist interests, right? And so one thing that Trump is doing, everyone who went to the BRICS summit got threatened with tariffs, right? And India is no exception. So it's like if you're a country, you went to the BRICS summit this year in Brazil, he's threatening to hit you with at least like a baseline 10% tariff. So he threatened to impose new tariffs on India over its participation in the forum. A lot of people are saying, like Bloomberg saying, it puts Delhi in a tough position as it races to finalize a favorable trade deal with the U.S. But Trump is definitely unhappy with some BRICS members and the entire institution of BRICS itself, who have been talking about an alternative reserve currency, and noted, and we need to note that India has differentiated between local currencies for trade, which it does, and de-dollarization. India is not interested really in de-dollarization, though they will work in local currencies, which is why they function in BRICS. And also, the U.S. is trying to cultivate India as a bulwark and an isolating bulwark against both China, which they have fought wars against, which they have a very complicated and belligerent relationship with, and also as part of the Iran-Pakistan isolation package as well. So, we'll go easy on India, and we'll keep trying to make India our like plant inside BRICS. And it's just not a helpful country at this point, and India has time and again differentiated between local currency trade and de-dollarization, which is like one of the main most salient points of BRICS, and they don't want to do that. There's no way the Hindufa fascist government is ever going to actually seek for de-dollarization. In fact, most of their wealth, all the oligarchs within India, like their wealth is based off the dollar. And they run the government. Like, there's no way India is ever going to want to de-dollarize, not unless there's a popular revolution, which is probably not going to happen.
This is actually generally a problem, not just with India, but the vast majority of countries, particularly as well, the Gulf monarchs as well, and even European leaders. And that is the fact that the vast majority of the political class and the ruling classes in these comprador states have have actual capital investments on the dollar and in the United States. And they're always looking at their own self-interest. And this is why we always have to remember, this is always a class war and not nationalize these kind of conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And this is no exception to just India alone. And I would actually even, sort of remind everybody what happened, the sort of short little war, I guess, or escalation of between Pakistan and India, which actually proved just why India itself is not a reliable sort of country to be inside BRICS, and that was its antagonistic relationship with China during those days.
Mm-hmm.
The fact of the matter is that obviously they had started targeting Pakistan, and even though it was a BRICS member nation state, a member of BRICS, China had stood by Pakistan and was directly opposing India, and it was the United States that needed to interject in order to supposedly establish a ceasefire between the two states. And the relationships between China and India historically have always been sour as a result of obviously territorial disputes, among other things. And obviously what happened between Pakistan and India, and the fact that this was something that was instigated by India itself, is not exactly to the liking of China. So again, we can see these fractures that exist within BRICS states, and why specifically a country like India, and I would also include Brazil, are not trustworthy within the BRICS alliance. This is my humble opinion on this. And at the end of the day as well, there's something else I kind of want to reference here, which I think is kind of important. There was an interview a few weeks back during the sort of 12th wave war between Iran and Israel, and it was conducted by Steve Bannon. Anybody who knows him knows who he is, and Michael Flynn. And in that interview, Michael Flynn was basically advocating that the sort of targeting of Iran is quintessential because we need to, by whatever means necessary, we need to eliminate Iran as an anti-Western country, and to try to put a new government in place that will be favorable to the West. And one of the strategic interests in doing that, beyond all the others that we have said, obviously Iran's role in BRICS, etc., is in fact to then create an alliance between India and a new Western pro-Iranian state. This was Michael Flynn's words, former national security advisor. Yeah. He had said to form an alliance with Iran to then target Pakistan, and Pakistan is also bordering China and the Xinjiang region, which is the gateway to the BRI. So this is where India. This is to understand how India is viewed in the United States.
Yeah, and the Xinjiang province is where their massive push for these like massive AI data centers
Mhm.
is going to be. Obviously, in the deserts in that region, like no one really lives there, right? And they're very secluded, and they'd be very like top secret locations. But anyways, yeah, you even have like Israeli dudes from like ex IDF veterans who now work in Israeli think tank world saying after Iran, Pakistan's next. And of course,
Mhm.
the Pakistani government and military and intelligence services, the ISI, the Office of Strategic Services, but there are factions. There are pro-West factions. There are like isolationist factions. There are deeply, deeply anti-West factions within the government. But now they are kind of seeing this. And I talked to a lot of journalists in Pakistan. Lived in the region for a long time. They're kind of now seeing this coalescence of like this existential threat now, because of course there's different factions and coalitions within the Iranian government, and the U.S. isn't really trying to cultivate a lot of them. They're just like collapse the whole regime. And so they're like looking at this and they're like, well, we're probably going to get caught up in this too. So it's actually kind of unifying some of these people to be like, okay, there is now
Mhm.
an existential threat because we are a nuclear program. And even though our nuclear program is regional, it only deals with India. Now, we've seen defense reporting that they're starting an ICBM, like intercontinental ballistic missile program, not because they want to use it, but just because now they need it as a deterrent to make their nuclear program global and not just regional. Because this is where U.S. foreign policy and it's to isolate one nation at a time, one by one, take them out. And
Mhm.
this is why BRICS was kind of created in the first place and why it's solidifying. And yes, there's a lot of kinks, there's a lot of problems and inherent contradictions, but this is what we're looking at right now. Pakistan is the next Iran. Even though we have great allies in Pakistan, they've done the dirty work of the CIA for decades.
Mhm.
That doesn't matter right now. That doesn't matter anymore.
Because
This is about
no, because
domination.
it's also because Pakistan has now created new relations with China. They're
Mhm.
engaging in trade routes, pipelines, all of that. Again, part of the BRI, but also in other ways. So where Pakistan obviously was, a hub for terrorist, training that served the West for many decades. It now has realigned, and we're seeing, Pakistan establish those kind of relations with, the alternative BRICS, and particularly with China, and also obviously its close relation, the fact that it shares a border with China. It makes Pakistan again in itself a threat. And this is precisely the reason why Pakistan had come out and effectively said that if there's going to be a war and an attack on Iran, or any sort of severe attack, that they were more than willing to join in said war, because this is not just for, because of the kindness of their hearts and just to support Iran, but also because their own existence, as it currently stands, depends on it. So, this is what's effectively happening, and why we have to kind of view everything that's happening globally as in the interconnected ways that it is. Because I think I was actually even looking with regards to like the Bunker Buster Act. I even mentioned this in my article. Although that it's been tailored towards targeting possibly Iran, this is kind of why there's been these renewed calls for it. I would also argue they're probably going to try that on Lebanon, but that's just my argument. But beyond that, the it's interesting because when you look at what their agenda is, according to the Path to Persia article, the policy paper, it actually speaks specifically to allow Israel to target nuclear facilities in Iran, knowing full well they probably won't eliminate Iran's nuclear capabilities, and Iran will be able to kind of go back to kind of build back whatever it was lost within no time. And we're also seeing Iran kind of purchasing at this point in time air defense systems from China, so it is rebuilding itself. It's rebuilding itself rather quickly. But one of the arguments as well made through the policy paper of the Path to Persia is to continuously start hitting Iran whenever it's considered to be building up its nuclear capacity. And then this idea would be to try to then by continuously doing that, to kind of put enough pressure of an Iranian state to collapse, because they know they can't necessarily invade or destroy Iran, but they're going to do whatever they can to bring about that regime change to then go after Pakistan. And India is going to play a big part of that. But again, we're not saying, and I want to be very clear about this, because sometimes when I kind of outline what the agenda is here, people think that it's because I believe that's what's going to happen. No, I don't necessarily think that these projects are going to be successful. There's a bunch of other events that are going to happen, and internal contradictions within, for example, Lebanon, within Syria and Iran, etc. and BRICS that are going to change how they're going to define how successful this is going to be. I'm just really outlining, and I want to stress that what their agenda is, what their goals are, not that they're going to be successful, and that's the end game.
U.S. foreign policy has a playbook. It doesn't change. It doesn't. It's disrupt, play for time, exploit the chaos. These have been policy positions since I was a kid, since before I was probably even born. And they're very transparent. But of course, like, when does U.S. foreign policy really work out? It worked out more in the 90s, but we don't have the same power projection in terms of economic or military force, and our diplomatic soft power is like gone now too. So, look, as someone who's living in America, we might just destroy ourselves before we're even able to put in long-term imperial plans. Who knows? But I do have to wrap up because we got to go see a man about a black cat. So in northern Austin. So I think just to bring it all together, we just wanted to do this episode kind of highlighting U.S. foreign policy, starting in Gaza, which is the linchpin of all of this, expanding out into Lebanon, into the Levant, Iran, bring in BRICS, and then the larger plan for U.S. involvement in Central and South Asia. So it's a lot of information, but just wanted to highlight how these people think and how this stuff works, and hopefully that worked out for y'all.
And I just want to kind of say, kind of just to finish off what it is that you were saying, at the end of the day, they've always been able to buy time, isolate, much like, for example, in Syria, they're able to, kind of use a prolonged period of almost a decade, more than a decade, in order to establish their goals. But I do have to highlight that time is running out, which is why they're so desperate right now. And they're amplifying all these projects quickly because the innate contradictions of capitalism, the impact that it's had on the economy and of the West, the decline of the West, but also the rise of the global South, and China as an alternative and BRICS as an alternative, is causing them, out of desperation, to effectively act. Sorry, I know that my screen's jamming, but to act at sort of God's speed, so to say, which is not going to work in their favor. So I think that the next couple of years are going to be, to say the least, even more eventful than what we've seen up until this point.
Exactly. And I think everybody's strapping in for that. Every week has a more insane news cycle than the week before. So if you love 2025, you're going to absolutely hate 2026. But we'll be here, if I'm not sent to like alligator Alcatraz with all the other socialist swine, we'll be here commentating on it, doing analysis and reporting. So cheers, y'all. This has been the Wednesday episode. We will see you Friday on Patreon for our Fuck Around Fridays episode. So thanks, Elina, for coming on, and we'll see y'all when we see y'all. Cheers and good luck. I think Alina's frozen. So, yeah.